The news of his father's death struck Parker Evans like a thunderbolt on a clear day, shattering the carefully constructed world he'd built far from the sprawling vineyard where he'd grown up. Standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in Manhattan, he stared at the email from his father's attorney, the words blurring before his eyes as memories flooded back memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Mr. Evans. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 3 o'clock is waiting." Parker cleared his throat. "Cancel all my appointments for the next 2 weeks and book me on the next flight to Sonoma." "Sir." His assistant's surprise was evident. Parker Evans, 35-year-old founder and CEO of Evans Financial Consulting, never canceled appointments. "Family emergency," he said simply, already pulling his laptop closed. 8 hours later, Parker's rental car crunched up the familiar gravel driveway of Crescent Hill Vineyard. Twilight was settling over the valley, painting the endless rows of grapevines in soft purples and blues. The main house, a sprawling California Spanish-style home with a red tiled roof, stood silent, waiting for him. He hadn't been back since he was 20. 15 years of building his own empire in New York. 15 years of ignoring his father's occasional calls to come home and take his rightful place at the vineyard. Their last argument had been explosive, with his father accusing him of abandoning their legacy and Parker vowing never to return to the life that felt like a prison. Now, as he stepped onto the wide veranda, key in hand, he was the reluctant heir to everything he'd once rejected. The house smelled the same oak, leather, and the faint sweetness of wine that seemed embedded in the walls. Parker moved through the quiet rooms, touching familiar furniture, looking at old family photos. His mother, gone for 20 years now, his father, stern-faced but proud in every image. And himself, a skinny kid with wild dreams of something beyond these hills. He poured himself 3 fingers of his father's favorite Cabernet from the wine cellar and sat on the back terrace overlooking the vineyard. Tomorrow, he'd meet with the estate attorneys. Tomorrow, he'd begin the process of settling his father's affairs and likely putting the vineyard up for sale. Tonight, he would allow himself to feel the complicated grief of losing a father he'd never reconciled with. The following morning arrived with a burst of California sunshine that flooded his childhood bedroom. Parker dressed in the only casual clothes he'd packed, dark jeans and a light blue button-down, and headed to the kitchen. The housekeeper, Maria, who'd been with the family since he was a child, was already there preparing coffee. "Mr. Parker," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "You look so much like your father now." Parker accepted her hug awkwardly. "It's good to see you, Maria." "I'm sorry it's under these circumstances. Your father was very proud of you," she said, pouring him coffee. "He kept every article about your success." Parker looked away, unprepared for this revelation. "I need to survey the property before meeting the attorneys." "Has anything changed significantly?" Maria filled him in on the vineyard's operations as he ate a quick breakfast. His father had apparently maintained their reputation for quality, though production had decreased in recent years. Parker made mental notes, already thinking like a businessman. The vineyard would likely fetch a good price, especially in the current market. He spent the morning walking the familiar paths between the vines, noting areas that needed attention and improvements that had been made. The main vineyard house was well maintained, but some of the outbuildings showed signs of neglect. He was making notes on his phone when he noticed something unexpected: a new fence line, and beyond it, rows of what looked like organic lavender. He muttered to himself, stepping closer to the property line. What had once been the abandoned Brooks farm next door was now a thriving operation. Where there had once been overgrown fields and dilapidated buildings, Parker now saw neat rows of lavender, several beehives in the distance, and a renovated farmhouse with a new coat of pale yellow paint. As he stood contemplating this change, a woman emerged from between the lavender rows. She was tall and slender, wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a basket filled with purple blooms. She moved with purpose, completely absorbed in her task until she glanced up and noticed him, For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the fence line. Then she approached, pulling off gardening gloves and pushing her hat back to reveal a face that struck Parker with unexpected force. Open, sun-kissed, with striking green eyes and a small scar above her left eyebrow. "You must be Victor's son," she said, her voice holding a slight trace of wariness. Parker nodded, extending a hand across the fence. "Parker Evans." "Brooke Elliott," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. Her palm was calloused, her grip strong. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you," Parker said automatically. "Did you know him well?" Something flickered in her expression. "Well enough, he was particular about his boundaries." Parker couldn't help a short laugh. "That's a diplomatic way of putting it." She smiled then, and it transformed her face. "I purchased this place 4 years ago. Your father wasn't thrilled about my methods initially." "Methods?" "I run completely organic operations. No pesticides, all sustainable farming practices." She gestured to her lavender fields. "Your father was concerned it would affect his vines." Parker could imagine his father's reaction to having an organic farmer next door. Victor Evans had been old school in his approach to winemaking. "Did he give you trouble?" Parker asked. Brooke tilted her head. "We reached an understanding eventually. He even helped me with some irrigation issues last year." She studied him. "Are you staying long?" "Just long enough to settle the estate," Parker replied. "I have a business in New York." "Ah," something like disappointment crossed her face. "Well, if you need anything while you're here, I'm just across the fence." With that, she nodded goodbye and returned to her harvesting, leaving Parker with an odd sense of having missed something important. The meeting with the attorneys was straightforward. His father had left everything to him: the vineyard, the house, the considerable assets, with specific instructions that Parker take time to review the vineyard operations before making any decisions about its future. There was also a personal letter, which Parker tucked into his jacket pocket to read later. What was less straightforward was the financial situation of Crescent Hill Vineyard. While still prestigious, the business had been declining in profitability for the past few years. His father had been considering some modernization, but hadn't implemented any changes before his unexpected heart attack. "The harvest is in 6 weeks," the estate attorney, Jonathan Mercer, explained. "The seasonal workers are expecting to start in 4. You'll need to decide whether to proceed with this year's production or sell the grapes to other wineries." Parker rubbed his temples. "And if I want to sell the entire property?" "Certainly possible, but you'd get a better price after a successful harvest. Especially if you improve this year's numbers." This was not what Parker had planned. He had clients waiting in New York, deals that needed his attention. He couldn't possibly stay for months to oversee a grape harvest. Back at the house, Parker poured himself another glass of wine and finally opened his father's letter. The handwriting was as he remembered: strong, deliberate strokes that matched the man himself. "Parker," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I've failed to tell you what I should have said years ago. I was wrong to try to force your path. Your mother always said you were meant for more than just these hills, and she was right. You've built something impressive on your own terms, and I'm proud of you. But these vines are still your heritage. Before you decide their fate, I ask only that you spend one harvest season here. Understand what we've built before you dismantle it. The vineyard needs new vision, perhaps yours, perhaps someone else's, but don't discard it without knowing its value. I've made arrangements with the estate to cover any business losses you might incur during this time. Consider it my final request and perhaps my way of making amends for our lost years. With respect and love, your father." Parker set down the letter, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within him. His father had never been a man of many words and certainly never of apologies. This posthumous olive branch left him unsettled. He walked onto the terrace, staring out at the vineyard as twilight descended once more. One harvest season, 3 months at most. Could he really afford to step away from his company for that long? And yet, how could he refuse his father's final request? As darkness fell, lights came on across the lavender farm. Through the trees, Parker could see the farmhouse windows glowing warmly. On impulse, he grabbed a bottle of Crescent Hill's best vintage and set off across the property. Brooke Elliott was sitting on her front porch when he approached, reading something on a tablet with a cup of tea beside her. She looked up, surprised, as he climbed the steps. "Peace offering," Parker said, holding up the wine. "I thought we might continue our conversation from earlier." Brooke closed her tablet. "That's a $60 bottle of wine for a casual conversation." "Is that a no?" She smiled. "That's an observation. I'd be happy for the company." She gestured to the chair beside her. "I'll get another glass." When she returned, they fell into surprisingly easy conversation. Brooke told him how she'd left a high-pressure job in agricultural research to start her lavender farm. "Everyone thought I was crazy," she said, pouring more wine, "trading a corner office for dirt under my fingernails." "But you don't regret it?" Parker asked. "Not for a second. There's something about working with the land." She trailed off, looking at the stars now visible above them. "It's real in a way my previous work never was." "My father felt that way about the vineyard," Parker admitted. "I never understood it." Brooke turned to him. "And what about you? What's real to you?" Parker considered the question. "Building something from nothing, taking risks that pay off, solving problems that seem unsolvable. And does your work in New York give you that?" "It did," he said, surprised by his use of the past tense. "I've built a successful consulting firm from the ground up. We specialize in financial restructuring for struggling companies." "So you fix things," Brooke said, in a manner of speaking. "Though usually by streamlining, cutting excess, making hard choices." Brooke nodded thoughtfully. "Not unlike farming, actually. Sometimes you have to prune severely to get the best yield." Parker found himself smiling at the comparison. "I never thought of it that way." As the evening progressed, Parker found himself increasingly drawn to Brooke's combination of pragmatism and passion. She spoke about her lavender and honeybees with the same intensity he reserved for market analyses and client strategies. "I should let you get back to your reading," he said finally, noticing the late hour. "Actually, I was reviewing some research on companion planting," Brooke admitted. "I'm always looking for ways to improve soil health naturally. Does it work your organic approach?" "Come see for yourself," she offered. "I could give you a tour tomorrow. Maybe you'll learn something useful for the vineyard." Parker hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." The next morning, Brooke showed him around her 20-acre farm with evident pride. Beyond the lavender fields, she had a small orchard of olive trees, several vegetable gardens, and a greenhouse where she experimented with different growing methods. "The honeybees are the heart of it all," she explained as they approached the hives, each painted a different pastel color. "They pollinate everything and produce honey we can sell." Parker watched in amazement as Brooke, now dressed in protective gear, opened a hive and calmly showed him the inner workings. Her hands moved with gentle confidence among the thousands of buzzing insects. "Aren't you afraid of getting stung?" he asked through the mesh of the hat she'd lent him. "Respect them, and they generally respect you back," she replied. "Though I've had my share of stings, you learn to work through the pain." Throughout the tour, Parker was struck by how much thought Brooke put into every aspect of her operation. Nothing was wasted, everything served multiple purposes. It was efficiency of a different kind than he practiced in business, but no less impressive. "Your father thought I was naive when I first moved in," Brooke said as they walked back toward the main house. "He told me organic farming was a pipe dream, that I'd be out of business within a year." "What changed his mind?" Parker asked. "Results," she said simply. "When my lavender thrived without chemicals and my honey started winning regional awards, he became curious, started asking questions." Inside her farmhouse, Brooke showed Parker her small processing area where she created lavender products, soaps, oils, sachets, and more. The space was organized with the same efficiency as her fields. "So you're not just a farmer," Parker observed. "You're running a sophisticated business operation." "Is that approval I hear from the big city consultant?" Brooke teased. "It is," Parker admitted. "Though I'm curious what made you choose this particular location," something flickered in Brooke's expression. "The soil conditions are perfect for what I wanted to grow, and—" She hesitated. "I had a connection to this area from childhood." Before Parker could ask more, his phone rang his assistant in New York with an urgent client issue. "The real world intruding. I need to take this," he said apologetically. "Of course," Brooke nodded. "I have work to do anyway." Parker spent the rest of the day on conference calls, trying to manage his business remotely while beginning to review the Vineyard's books. The more he dug into Crescent Hill's finances, the more he realized his father had been facing significant challenges: increased competition, rising costs, and declining sales. There were solutions, Parker knew, but they would require investment and vision. That evening, as Parker sat on the terrace with spreadsheets open on his laptop, he noticed Brooke walking along the fence line, checking her irrigation system. Without thinking, he walked down to meet her. "Find anything interesting in the Vineyard books?" she asked, seeing the preoccupied look on his face. "How did you know that's what I was doing?" she smiled. "You have the same expression your father used to get during budgeting season." Parker leaned against the fence. "The Vineyard is in trouble, not critical yet, but heading there." "I suspected as much," Brooke nodded. "Victor was worried last year about the new conglomerate buying up small wineries in the valley." "Westland Agricultural Group," Parker confirmed. "They've made 2 offers already, according to the files. My father rejected both." "They approached me too," Brooke admitted. "Wanted to buy my water rights." Parker straightened. "When was this?" "About 6 months ago. I turned them down flat. Something about their representative gave me the creeps. All talk about efficiency and standardization." She made a face. "The last thing this valley needs is more corporate farming." Parker felt a twinge of discomfort, recognizing in her description the kind of language he might use himself in a business context. "What would you do," he asked suddenly, "if you were in my position with the Vineyard?" Brooke considered the question seriously. "I'd look for ways to adapt without losing what makes Crescent Hill special. Your father's techniques may be old school, but his commitment to quality was uncompromising." "The business model needs updating," Parker said, "maybe. But remember that what looks inefficient to an outsider might be essential to the end product." She smiled at him. "Not everything valuable shows up neatly on a spreadsheet, Parker." The next few days fell into a pattern. Parker spent his mornings on calls with his New York office, his afternoons diving into the Vineyard operations with the longtime manager, Hector, and his evenings often in conversation with Brooke. Sometimes they sat on her porch, sometimes they walked the boundary between their properties, and once they drove into town together for supplies, earning curious glances from locals who clearly recognized the Evans air with the newcomer they'd come to know. Parker found himself increasingly drawn to Brooke's practical wisdom and quiet confidence. She spoke his business language well enough to challenge his thinking, but maintained a groundedness that reminded him of what he'd been missing in his high-rise existence. One evening, when Parker mentioned his father's letter and the request to stay for the harvest, Brooke nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Harvesting is when you really understand what this life is about," she said. "It's when everything you've worked for comes to fruition or doesn't." "I'm not sure my company can function without me for that long," Parker admitted. Brooke raised an eyebrow. "If your company can't survive 3 months without you, you haven't built it properly." The comment stung, but Parker recognized the truth in it. He'd created a business that depended too much on his personal involvement, partly from ego, partly from fear of letting go. The next day, Parker called his second in command, Leslie, and proposed a temporary leadership restructuring that would allow him to remain in California through October. It wasn't an easy conversation, but by the end, they had a workable plan. As June turned to July, Parker found himself increasingly involved in the Vineyard's operations. He worked alongside the crew, checking the developing grape clusters, learning about the timing of veraison when the grapes would begin to change color. He studied the weather patterns and soil conditions, drew on his business experience to improve inventory systems, and began formulating ideas for modernizing their marketing approach. And always, Brooke was nearby, a sounding board, an inspiration, and increasingly, a distraction. Parker found himself looking for excuses to consult with her, to show her his ideas, to hear her laugh at his city slicker mistakes. One morning, after a brief summer rain, Parker found Brooke at the fence line examining some vines with a concerned expression. "Problem?" he asked, joining her. "Maybe," she said, pointing to some leaves that showed small spots. "This looks like the beginning of powdery mildew. With the humidity after the rain, it could spread quickly." Parker frowned. "Hector mentioned we're due for our regular fungicide treatment next week." "Next week might be too late," Brooke said, "and that section backs up to my property." "Are you asking me to spray chemicals ahead of schedule?" Parker teased. "The organic farmer wants me to use the evil fungicide." Brooke rolled her eyes. "I'm not ideological about it, I'm practical. Your conventional methods and my organic ones can coexist if we're thoughtful about it." She hesitated. "Actually, I've been experimenting with a natural fungicide that might help. It won't be as immediately effective as your chemical option, but it could slow the spread until your regular treatment." "You do that, help the competition. We're neighbors, not competitors," Brooke said simply. "Besides, I don't want your mildew spreading to my plants either." Together, they spent the day applying Brooke's natural solution to the affected vines. Parker was struck by how easily they worked as a team, anticipating each other's movements, sharing water bottles in the hot sun, problem-solving on the fly when the sprayer clogged. By evening, they were exhausted, dirt-streaked, and surprisingly satisfied with their work. "I think I've done more physical labor in the past week than in the previous decade," Parker admitted as they sat on the tailgate of Brooke's truck, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold. "It suits you," Brooke said. When Parker looked at her questioningly, she added, "You seem more present than when you first arrived." Parker considered this. "I've been thinking about what you said about not everything valuable showing up on a spreadsheet. I'm starting to understand what my father meant about knowing the value of this place." Brooke nodded, her eyes on the distant mountains. "There's value in building something with your hands, in working with nature instead of just extracting from it." "Is that why you left your research job?" Parker asked. "To find that kind of value." Brooke was quiet for a moment. "Partly. But also because of my father." "What happened?" "He was a farmer who lost everything to corporate agriculture," she said softly. "He worked for 30 years building a family farm in the Central Valley, only to be squeezed out by bigger operations that could produce more for less. By the time I was in college, he was working as a consultant for the very corporations that had put him out of business." "I'm sorry," Parker said. "He died believing he'd failed," Brooke continued. "That's why I'm so committed to proving sustainable farming can be viable. It's not just environmental idealism, it's about creating agricultural systems that don't destroy the people who work in them." Parker felt a new understanding of Brooke's passion and an uncomfortable parallel to his own story. "So this place is your way of honoring him." "In a way," she admitted. "Though I didn't plan to end up next door to Victor Evans, of all people." "What do you mean?" Brooke looked at him in surprise. "You don't know, your father and my father were business partners decades ago. They had a small vineyard together before Crescent Hill existed." Parker stared at her. "That's impossible. My father started Crescent Hill on his own." "After buying out my father's share," Brooke said gently, "there was a disagreement about direction. Your father wanted to expand, mine wanted to stay small and diversified. They dissolved the partnership, and your father used the loan he got to build Crescent Hill into what it became, while your father moved to the Central Valley to start over," Brooke finished. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Parker. It was business. They made different choices." Parker was silent, processing this revelation. It explained why the name Elliott had seemed vaguely familiar when they first met. It explained why his father had been so territorial about the property line. "Is that why you bought this place?" he finally asked. "To come back and prove something to my father," Brooke shook her head. "I bought it because the price was right and the conditions were perfect for what I wanted to grow. Finding out it bordered Evans' property was a shock, believe me. I almost backed out of the deal." "What changed your mind?" "Stubbornness," she admitted with a small smile. "And maybe a little bit of fate. I thought there was a certain poetry to it, the children of former partners becoming neighbors, trying different approaches to the same land." Parker found himself captivated by the determined set of her jaw, the passion in her eyes as she spoke. Before he could stop himself, he leaned forward and kissed her. For a moment, Brooke froze in surprise. Then she was kissing him back, her hand coming up to touch his face with unexpected tenderness. When they broke apart, Parker was the first to speak. "I've been wanting to do that for days." "Just days," Brooke teased softly. "I've been thinking about it since you showed up at my door with that ridiculously expensive bottle of wine." They laughed together, the tension of the moment breaking into something warmer, more comfortable. Yet as they parted ways that night, Parker felt a new tension building, the knowledge that his time in California had a definite end point, while Brooke was rooted here as firmly as her lavender plants. The next few weeks brought them closer, both professionally and personally. Parker consulted Brooke on vineyard decisions, impressed by her knowledge of the local ecosystem. They spent evenings planning future plantings, discussing marketing strategies that could highlight both their products, even sketching ideas for collaborative products like lavender-infused wine. In quiet moments together, watching the sunrise from her porch, sharing meals prepared from her garden, walking the rows of ripening grapes, Parker found himself contemplating a future very different from the one he'd planned. Then came the offer from Westland Agricultural Group. Their representative, a smooth-talking executive named Dawson, arrived unannounced at Crescent Hill one morning. "We've heard you might be more open to selling than your father was," he said, sliding a proposal across the desk to Parker. "This is significantly more than we offered him." The figure was indeed substantial enough to solve all the vineyard's financial problems and still leave a hefty profit. From a purely business perspective, it was a compelling offer. "I'll need time to consider it," Parker said neutrally. "Of course," Dawson replied. "Though I should mention we've also renewed our interest in the neighboring property. Miss Elliott's operation would complement our holdings nicely." Parker kept his expression impassive. "Has she indicated any interest in selling?" "Not yet," Dawson admitted, "but everyone has their price. And water access in this valley is becoming increasingly valuable. It would be a shame if her supply became compromised." The thinly veiled threat made Parker's blood boil, but he maintained his professional demeanor until Dawson left. Then he immediately went to find Brooke. She was in her workshop, bottling lavender oil, and looked up in surprise at his agitated entrance. "Westland just made an offer on Crescent Hill," he said without preamble, "and they're coming after your farm next." Brooke set down the bottle she was filling. "How much?" Parker told her the figure. Her eyebrows rose. "That's a lot of money, Parker. Are you considering it?" "A week ago I might have been," he admitted. "It solves all the immediate problems, but there was something about their representative." He explained Dawson's veiled threat about her water access. Brooke's expression hardened. "They've been trying to control the water rights throughout the valley. If they get enough adjacent properties, they could essentially dictate terms to everyone else." "I'm not going to sell to them," Parker said firmly, "but that means figuring out how to make Crescent Hill viable long-term." "You sound like you're planning to stay," Brooke observed carefully. Parker met her gaze. "I'm considering it." "What about your company in New York?" "I've been talking with Leslie about a restructuring. She's been effectively running day-to-day operations since I've been here. It might be time to make that official, make her CEO while I remain on as chairman but focus elsewhere." "On the vineyard." "On building something new," Parker clarified. "I've been thinking about what you said about honoring your father's memory. Maybe there's a way to honor mine too, not by maintaining the status quo, but by evolving what he built." Brooke smiled slowly. "What exactly are you thinking?" "A partnership," Parker said. "Your organic methods, my business experience. We combine resources, create a model for sustainable winemaking that incorporates your diversification principles. We could even repurpose some of the underused vineyard land for your lavender and other crops." "A partnership," Brooke repeated, a gleam in her eye. "Professional or—" Parker moved closer to her. "I was hoping for both. Unless that's a conflict of interest, I think we can manage the potential conflicts," she said, her voice soft as she reached for his hand. The harvest season arrived in a flurry of activity. Parker worked alongside the crew, experiencing firsthand the culmination of a year's worth of care. The work was exhausting but deeply satisfying, especially with Brooke often joining them, bringing her workers to help during the critical days of picking. Their plan for a joint venture took shape as the grapes were crushed and the fermentation process began. They would maintain Crescent Hill's premium wines while introducing a new line that showcased organic practices. They would expand Brooke's lavender operation and add a tasting room that featured both their products. Most importantly, they would implement water conservation systems that would serve as a model for the valley, directly countering Westland's strategy of water control. On the final evening of harvest, Parker and Brooke hosted a celebration for both their crews. Under strings of lights hung between the vines, with tables laden with food from Brooke's garden and wine from Parker's cellar, they thanked everyone who had made their vision possible. Later, as they stood together watching their workers dancing to music from someone's portable speaker, Parker slipped his arm around Brooke's waist. "I never expected this when I came back," he admitted. "I thought I'd sell everything and leave as quickly as possible. And now?" Brooke asked, turning to face him. "Now I'm thinking about roots," Parker said, "about building something that lasts beyond spreadsheets and quarterly reports." "Roots are good," Brooke smiled. "They provide stability, draw nourishment from the soil, but they also need room to grow." "I was thinking the same thing," Parker said, taking her hands in his. "Which is why I've decided to keep my apartment in New York, not to return to my old life, but so we can travel there when we need a change of scenery. I don't want either of us to feel trapped by our choices." Brooke's eyes widened in surprise. "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about little else," Parker admitted. "I love you, Brooke. I want to build this new venture with you, the business, yes, but more importantly, a life together." "I love you too," Brooke said softly. "And I accept your partnership proposal, all aspects of it." As they sealed their agreement with a kiss, cheers erupted from their workers who had been not so subtly watching the exchange. Laughing, Parker and Brooke joined the celebration, dancing under the stars that shone above the vines and lavender that would sustain them in the years to come. In the months and years that followed, Crescent Hill and Elliott Farms became a singular operation that maintained their distinct identities while functioning as one. Their sustainable practices attracted attention throughout the region, inspiring other small producers to resist corporate buyouts. The business thrived beyond their expectations, with their lavender-infused wines winning awards and their collaborative approach creating a model others sought to emulate. But more meaningful than their professional success was the life they built together, tending the land that had shaped both their fathers, creating something new from the legacy they'd inherited, and proving that the most valuable growth isn't always measured in profits, but in the roots that anchor us and the love that helps us flourish.